Welcome to the WAVY Digital Desk. I'm here with Benjamin Milewski from Old Dominion University. He is a political science professor and doctor at Old Dominion University. I wanted to talk to him, specifically tonight about a few things. I know that people aren't probably surprised with some of the results that are coming in, but let's just start at the beginning. It's Super Tuesday. 15 states and 1 U.S. territory are holding their primary elections for a president. Now, in those, obviously, we don't have some of the results yet. As sort of the time moves west, we're going to get more in. We might even get more in now at 8:30 and then coming in the rest of the hour. We're going to be here with you for the next 30 minutes. You can also catch Ben on WAVY TV 10 tonight at 10 and 11 with Andy Fox. There's going to be much more coming up then. Ben, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Pleasure as always.
You're with us every election day, really, and so you're used to sort of the rigmarole of sort of figuring out what results are coming in, and et cetera. But I wanted to start with the headlines. In the last hour or so, we found out the projected winner for North Carolina's GOP primary and Virginia's GOP primary is Trump.
Right.
To you, I just want to start with that. No surprises there.
None at all. And I think that's the expectation for pretty much the entire night, right? As we head, west here. Trump and Biden, that's what the matchup is. And I think that's what really tonight is this kind of galvanization of the kind of the election season. And of course, we still have primaries to, take place through the rest of, next month and beyond. But it really all eyes are turning now on November. And we even heard Trump say that, right? He, when asked about Haley, he said, look, he's putting her in the rearview mirror. He's turning his eyes to November and facing down on Biden.
And, today the stakes were high for Haley. 865 delegates were at stake. Now you need 1,215 delegates to win the nomination. But, tonight is sort of make or break.
Very much so. And it's a tough night going in, right? When you kind of break down the various states and how they give out their delegates. Nikki's going to collect some delegates, right? But if you want me to dive into some of the numbers here, we got a little bit more time. Of the number of delegates that are out there tonight, 238 delegates. So we're talking about North Carolina, Tennessee, Minnesota, Colorado, Alaska, and then the one from Arkansas are given out proportionally. So in those 238 delegates, depending how Nikki does in those states, she will collect some delegates, right? It just depends how well she does. Typically she's getting about a third of the vote. So she may get a third of those 238. Then you move into the next basket of votes, right? And of the states that are voting, there's 195 Republican delegates. That's in Texas, here in Virginia, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And they give out some of their delegates by congressional district. So if you win 50% or more in that congressional district, you get that vote or those delegates there. So she has potential, depending on some of the areas, to pick up a little bit more votes there as well, too. Where it starts to hurt then is the other 421 delegates, which are given out by statewide vote percentages. So that's California, Massachusetts, Alabama, Maine, Utah, Oklahoma, Vermont, Texas, Arkansas, and some of Virginia as well too, right? So you have to get 50% or more of the state. And if you get that, you get the entire pot, right? So you take a state like California. That's 169 delegates. So these are a lot of delegates, which for the most part, Trump is going to get all of them. And as we're seeing tonight, he's winning these states.
And that's interesting, too, because, we've seen it before. Even before D.C., Nikki Haley did get some of the delegates, even though she had not actually won a state.
Right. And it's all very early on in the primary process, right? We utilize a lot of proportional voting, right? So as long as you get some percentage of the vote, you're going to get some percentage of the delegates. And that allowed Nikki to at least argue that she had potential to kind of pick up more delegates, kind of what Trump did early on in 2016, right? You kind of start off in these proportional races. There was a lot more candidates at that period of time with a field of, 14, 15, 16 candidates. So he was picking up and kind of snowballing and then building his base of support. And Nikki could try to make the argument like, hey, I can pick up some delegates here. But as that field really shrunk, the ability for her to make that argument of like, yeah, moving on into the kind of the winner-take-all primary elections, it became a much harder story to tell.
And can you just talk about the timeline a little bit? How usual or unusual is it to sort of be, down to one candidate at this point?
And it varies on the election cycle. We've seen in the past where, some candidates, just based upon the field of challengers that are out there, wrap it up fairly quickly. I mean, just right off the top of my head, goes back to John McCain, right? I mean, when he ran against in 2008, there we go, he basically had it sewed up by Super Tuesday. However, in that election cycle, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were the two that basically ended up kind of trading blows all the way pretty much down to the Democratic primary or Democratic convention. So it does happen from time to time, right? It's not like this is a once in a lifetime thing to see.
Right, and then, we'll have to wait, as you said before, in prepping for this, they're going to have to wait till the GOP convention in August to actually solidify that nomination.
Right, I mean, so Nikki's argument this entire time has been, I will stay in as long as I'm competitive and as long as I can continue to give voters essentially a second option. And competitiveness is tricky, right? So depending how she does tonight, right, she could try to make an argument, I'm still getting 30% of the vote, and that's competitive, right, to an extent, right? And she could make the argument that until the convention is actually held, Donald Trump, even if he gets to that 1,215 delegates, which he will be the presumptive nominee. But until the actual convention is held and the votes are cast, he's not the formal nominee yet. So she could make the argument, yeah, there still are election contests between now and the convention time. I'm staying in and providing those voters, that 30% of the Republican electorate, I'm giving them a second choice on the ballot.
And do you think she was relying on the open primary states, but also the partially open primary states to sort of make more of that impact? Yeah,
very much so. From the very beginning, we know that Donald Trump's kind of core supporters, they are diehard, they will vote for him come hell or high water. For Nikki Haley, it was a chance for her to essentially make a splash early and say, hey, I can compete against those core supporters. And you almost needed not an illusion, but more a perception that if you bring in the independents, you bring in some party-crossing Democrats, right? And you can actually then fight back against those kind of core supporters and then make the argument, hey, going into November, if you looked back then at the head-to-head generic polls of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden and myself, Nikki Haley versus Joe Biden, I come out better than Donald Trump does. So therefore, what do I have to do? I can attract independents. I can attract maybe some Democrats that are not enthused with Joe Biden. And maybe then I can win in November. And that was the argument she tried to make. But really from the start, New Hampshire was her night, to really do that. And she basically fell short of projections, even in New Hampshire, from the very start.
And I want to talk a little bit about that voter turnout, because I think the numbers so far, and just to give an update, in this area, before we came into this conversation, it was really only about, high 50% reporting in. But the numbers were low, right? They were at like 2 to 3%, even in some counties. What do you make of that turnout, at least on the GOP side, where there actually were candidates to vote for?
Well, it comes down to, even though there are candidates to vote for, what are you doing with your vote, right? So it's like, if going into election night tonight, it's kind of Trump would be the presumptive winner, right? You expect him to win tonight. So therefore, if you go out and vote in the Republican primary, say you're here in Virginia, right? You're a Democrat who wants to vote in the Republican primary. Why? Right? Nikki Haley's most likely not going to win, right? So in terms of actually casting a meaningful vote to actually change the outcome of the election, that's not going to happen. Could you maybe cast a vote for maybe a more symbolic, or to cast that kind of like doubt, right, that there is a large number of Republicans against Trump? Yes, but you're one of many, right? So it's, or do you vote in the Democratic primary for Joe Biden, who basically is just he's the only candidate on the ballot effectively and is going to sail into the Democratic nominations. So on a Tuesday night in some parts of the state, which are rainy, right, and parts of the country which are rainy, do you spend the time to go vote for basically a meaningless election? Most likely not.
And I wanted to give the latest, like Virginia Beach, for example, we're at 39% precincts reporting, and 4% voter turnout. So that's a lower number of precincts reporting so far, but 4% turnout for the GOP primary. Are we going to expect to see sort of this low number again in November, or have any exit polls on that yet?
No, I mean, so this is where we break it down in terms of people's kind of enthusiasm, right? So a lot of the polling going into tonight, we were breaking it down by demographics, so trying to figure out who's actually going to turn out to vote, right? So one of the things we saw, and this is something that both parties are going to have to take a look at, is by age, right? The 18 to 29-year-olds are showing that basically, one, they're not enthused with either candidate, right? And if you ask them, are you going to definitely vote in November, they're less likely to say yes, right? It's basically a small number that says they are 100% voting in November. If you break into the 30-plus-year-olds, right, then they're more likely to turn out. But still, the enthusiasm levels are not that high. So between now and November, both candidates and both parties have to do a lot of work, right, to essentially get out the vote, right? And this is where we're going to start to see a little bit of kind of placement, candidate placement taking place, right? So will Donald Trump try to tap into some of the numbers? Like if you look at blacks and Hispanics, right? These are demographics which Biden is holding right now, but for some of them by smaller margins than he held in 2020. So does Donald Trump do something like bring Tim Scott on as like his vice presidential running mate to try to court some of those voters, right? Is Biden going to change his stance on, say, Gaza and Palestine and Israel? Not change it, but maybe alter a little bit of kind of more strongly worded language, his stance towards Israel, maybe working through the UN to try to pick up some of those younger voters that clearly that is a huge issue for them. So we're going to see both the candidates starting to look ahead to November. Who do they have to get out? And when you start to dive into the exit polling tonight, who didn't turn out? That's going to be a key question for them.
And, in terms of all of the national news going on and public policy, obviously a lot of that weight is going to fall onto Biden versus Trump right now. I mean, do you think that's just going to be, we'll see how the summer goes in terms of some of these, wars going on?
Right. I think there's a lot of issues that are going to start to move their way up for the electorate as a whole. And that's the hard part is, it's March, right? For a lot of the electorate, we really don't start to think about elections as much as I'm always thinking about elections and the news is always thinking about it and social media makes you think about it. The average American, they're thinking about their dinner table. They're thinking about taking the kids to practice, right? These are, kind of more daily life issues, right? And we don't really start to turn our attention to November till we get closer to November. So the candidates do have a long runway, right? But between now and, say, the convention, this is when we're going to see the candidates start to put forward some of their platforms. They're going to try to shape the platform we'll see at the convention, which then is going to bring up a lot of the kind of the key issues which will motivate voters. I mean, if you go back to the last several election cycles, abortion, top of the list for many voters, right? Education's getting up there. Now we've got international policy. The economy's still always kind of hanging out there, right? And I mean, if you look at some of the really interesting polling data ahead of the Super Tuesday night, take things like the economy, right? It's the economy stupid, but other issues override that. But what we're seeing is based upon educational levels, voters without a college degree, in particular white voters, as well as some black and Hispanic, they view the economy under Trump much more favorably than they viewed the economy under Biden. Right? So is that, what have you done lately for me, or what have you done for me in the last 4 years? Is that going to come to kind of ride up there a little bit against Biden as we get closer? So again, long story short, I've kind of rambled a little bit here.
No, I mean, it's interesting to hear about all of the logistics that are sort of going to go into this.
Right, and it's just how do issues make their way to the surface for voters? And some of that is driven by the campaigns themselves, and some of that's going to be driven by just what comes up between now and November. I mean, there could be a significant change in foreign policy based upon something that takes place in Gaza.
And I wanted to give one update, just a couple minutes after we sat down. The decision desk from Nexstar is projecting Donald Trump the winner of the Arkansas Republican primary. So that's another one that we're going to add to the list tonight. And, again, we'll see as we're sort of moving through. I think there'll be more with you and Andy at 10 and 11 that will sort of be, called at that point or projected. I did want to talk about, with this Biden-Trump, 70% of Americans, and that was a stat we heard Nikki Haley use a lot, did not want the rematch, but the voting doesn't show that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, when we poll a representative sample for the country, right, it's not just core voters, right? So you're getting all swaths of Americans. However, on primary night, especially on nights when we're seeing very low turnout, right, who's coming out to vote? These are the people that are the kind of die-hard, partisan supporters, right? So they're the ones that are coming out and saying, yes, I want Donald Trump, or yes, I want Joe Biden, right? But when you ask kind of like largely all Americans, right, outside of that primary electorate, this is when we start to see that kind of cleavage come out and say, ooh, I don't know if I want to see that matchup again. I want somebody new. I want something new. And this is where potentially we'll start to see maybe some third parties start to emerge. I mean, we know RFK is kind of out there. We know that Jill Stein is potentially going to be running as a Green Party candidate. The No Labels Party is set to meet 3 days from now. So based upon the turnout we see tonight, how the results shake out, they may be fielding a candidate too. So it's kind of one of these, not that it's going to change kind of the face of the election, but maybe in more marginal races, as well as in maybe very close races, they could play spoiler.
And this third-party candidate, in other election years, we wouldn't even really discuss it. It would be something where we've seen candidates about, maybe we'll talk about them if they're a well-known figure, but this year it seems that the third-party candidate does hold a little bit more weight.
Yeah, because it comes down to, as we saw kind of in the matchup of 2020, it was a close race, right? And a couple of percent is kind of what we think about there, that if you have a certain preponderance of third-party candidates out there and you're kind of faced with a unenthused electorate, as well as maybe an electorate that just, can't even hold their nose to one of these candidates, either they don't turn out or they look for a third party. And I mean, so some of the exit polling tonight is showing, and I'd pulled this up earlier, breaking down in North Carolina and Virginia, Nikki Haley supporters were, in particular from the exit polling. In Virginia, 68% of those Nikki Haley supporters said they are unsure if they'll support the Republican nominee.
Wow.
I mean, that's a significant, so we're talking, all right, a third of the voting base that is of the Republican electorate that's for Nikki Haley, and 7/10 of them are saying they're not sure if they'll support Donald Trump. So some of them may, you'll want to see a Republican win, so or you've voted Republican your entire life, you'll still cast that vote. Or you stay home, or you shift to a third party. So it comes down to a numbers game, especially going back to 2020 of how close it was. You need every single vote you can get. So third parties can play spoiler, and this kind of fracturing within the party can play spoiler as well too.
And do you think that's going to come down to maybe the persuasiveness of candidates they trust? I mean, do you think it's going to come from seeing sort of what happens, in the federal government, on some decisions?
Yeah, I mean, so this is where you get into kind of the weeds of, every individual voter. I think you're going to see some voters that maybe will not throw away the top of the ticket, right? But maybe they start to get more focused on down ballot races, right? And that's where it really drives them to come out to vote. I mean, the reality is we're looking at a House where the Democrats are looking to pick up and take over the House in the next election cycle. I mean, they're targeting key seats GOP seats to flip. I mean, just in California alone tonight, they're targeting 7 seats that are held by GOP. So, I mean, maybe those races become more impactful. I mean, if you look at the Koch brothers in terms of polling support, monetary support from the Nikki Haley's campaign, they basically said, look, there's no kind of mathematical route forward that any amount of money we can throw at her is going to change the outcome of the presidential. But they'd said as part of that, it makes more sense for them to take that money and put it into down ballot races. So we may start to see, all right, we may not win, if you're a Republican, we may not win the White House, but hey, we should hold the House of Representatives, because if we can hold the House, we can stop, term 2 of Biden from pushing forward X, Y, and Z. It gives them at least some control. So maybe they start to focus down ballot.
And I was just looking to my right here at the Libertarian Party primary that North Carolina holds. There's nothing yet on that of a projected winner, but it is interesting. They had, give or take about 10 plus candidates on this list. I mean, there are a lot of people in North Carolina that are, that are running in this. There's not that many votes calculated in this, so I can't calculate exactly how many votes are coming in yet. But it is interesting that a state like North Carolina with so many eyes on it does hold a primary outside of the traditional Republican Democrat.
Right. And that's some of these come into ballot access laws. In some states, it's easier for third parties to make the ballot. It comes down to just how how organized and how impactful those parties are in the states, right? So we think about kind of state party apparatuses, right? Some like the Libertarian Party in North Carolina actually has a fairly strong foundation. Other states, not as much, right? So that's the kind of, we call this the heterogeneity of the American states, is that there's just inherent variation. So you're going to get some states like that where a third party is a little bit more viable.
In the variation of states, I want to talk about something that we spoke about in the lead up to this as well, is on the North Carolina ballots, you can vote, you don't have a preference.
Right.
And in other states we've seen, in Nevada, for example, Nikki Haley actually lost to none of the above.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that on the ballot?
Yeah, I pulled it up earlier, and I think there was, where is it? So it's Alabama, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, and Tennessee tonight. You still can all vote. You can vote uncommitted, basically. It's just kind of none of the above. And it's a kind of a... We saw this, like you said, out in Nevada. Nikki Haley faced it. We saw this in Michigan with Joe Biden, right? In most ways, it's kind of almost viewed as a protest vote, where it's kind of a none of the above. I don't like the candidates that are there, but I still do my civic duty. I'm going to go out to vote, and I'm just going to kind of I'm casting my vote to show you my displeasure with the field of candidates you put out there. The interesting thing is, based upon how these votes are given out, some of the uncommitted option will actually have delegates in some of these conventions, which is funny. But the reality is, this is more significant for the candidates to look forward to in November. Is you have people that, again, this is the parts of the Republican Party that, were Nikki Haley supporters. These are parts of both parties that are saying, I don't like any of these. These are voters that either will stay home, and you can't have that in such a close race in November. Or these are people that are waiting for the parties to kind of step up and give them something better. So is that, kind of the party putting their finger on the candidates and saying, hey, you have to do X, Y, and Z, or be better, or address this. So it's a good barometer for the parties and for the candidates of kind of displeasure against them.
And I was looking at North Carolina before we came in here, and Biden did have a bit more no preference to, let's say, the Trump-Nikki Haley. And I guess, a little bit more at stake there, perhaps. Right. But it was interesting that, I don't know, it's interesting that people show up to do that. And I understand the civic duty, but is that similar to, say, writing in a candidate or a name, during the presidential election?
Very much so. And whereas when you write in a candidate, right, it becomes kind of what we call the scattering of votes, right? So it's very much, these are just kind of votes that are cast for odds and ends, right? You can write in Mickey Mouse if you want to, and that's historically has been, kind of one of the most kind of written in names of all time. But these uncommitted options, right, or none of the above, that aggregates that all together. It's not just write-in votes, you're writing in your neighbor or whatnot. This is an actual, I don't like the listed options here. So therefore, it gives you a more unified voice to say that, as opposed to write-in, which is just scattering.
So interesting. And it's so interesting as well that obviously in Nevada, Nikki Haley did lose to that. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that, while there are no surprises tonight, the primary season is not over yet. So, I guess there's two options, right? If there is some sort of concession from Nikki Haley, what would the rest of the season look like?
Well, so I feel like, I've done my duty tonight. I've got my notes here. If you're just kind of looking ahead at the rest of the month, right? We've got a lot of big states that are here. So on the 12th, we've got Georgia, Hawaii, Mississippi, and Washington. The 15th, we have the Northern Mariana Islands. But then you hit the 19th, and then you've got Arizona, Florida, Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, and Ohio. And then on the 23rd, you got Louisiana. That's a lot of votes that are still out there, right? And then looking beyond that, we still have more races that take place later on in the electoral calendar. What that basically means is, one, by the end of the month, Trump will most likely have secured the 1,215 delegates he needs for the nomination. Two, what that means is that after that, these races really don't have much sway, right? They don't really mean anything in terms of, you've hit that magic number, you're the presumptive nominee. So for Nikki Haley, you kind of look ahead and you say, well, do I stay on the ballot, right? Because it is my right to stay on the ballot and continue to provide that alternative choice, right? That second option on the ballot, and give voters the ability to, again, express their displeasure and say, yes, I'm not for Donald Trump. Or do you kind of look at it more pragmatically and say, if you have aspirations in the future for 2028, you know, if members of the party are telling you you need to get out, is this hurting your political aspirations? So she may have a little bit of soul searching to do after tonight. So she could very quickly tonight come out and just say she's suspending her campaign, which will allow her to continue to essentially pay down debts and things like that. But for all intents and purposes, wrap it up. She could stay in. She could stay in basically until Trump gets the presumptive nomination, or she could ride the wave all the way until the convention. Maybe hope that Donald Trump is convicted, even though we did see in some of the exit polling tonight that a preponderance of Republican voters here in Virginia as well as in North Carolina said that if Trump is convicted, he is still fit to be the nominee. However, not amongst the Haley voters. So she has a couple of routes ahead of her. It just kind of comes down to, and I think Andy Fox said it earlier tonight, she can choose to leave on her time and on her terms. And I think that's kind of a perfect way to really sum up where she can go.
And for people who don't know at home, Trump does have we'll see, it seems to be in the direction right now, a party set up at Mar-a-Lago, an event. And Nikki Haley has chosen to be at home in South Carolina. She's made no plans to speak to the media at any point this evening. We'll see what comes tomorrow, obviously. But, in terms of the optics on that, she knew going into tonight that she wasn't going to have an event, right? That she wasn't going to have to speak to the media if that wasn't the best thing for her.
Right. And that's, it kind of goes all the way back to New Hampshire, right? That was her chance, right, to really make a splash, show that she could compete against Trump, that she could unify parts of the party. And as I said before, she underperformed. And as we've kind of progressed forward, we've moved really beyond in terms of the vote share of these delegates. A lot of these states with that proportional representation or a lot of these states that were open for independents as well as party crossing members. So it's as we've kind of moved closer to Super Tuesday, it's just gotten harder. And for her, she knows that based upon just the sheer math, it wasn't going to be a good night. She didn't get that ball rolling from New Hampshire forward that she was really hoping for. So to not hold a convention or an election party tonight, it's not worth it, right? If anything, that kind of maybe hurts image, right? She's effectively saving face, right? By, again, choosing when to speak to the media on her own terms.
And I want to talk, you brought up the legal battles for Trump, which would be interesting if she's sort of waiting for those. And we know that some of them are delayed, but they're in D.C., New York, Florida, Georgia. And at this point, we're waiting for the Supreme Court decision in April, which is sort of like the bigger highlight. Right. But, with those exit polls, again, it doesn't seem that holds much value in terms of how the vote's going to change.
Right. And so it comes down to, she could try to hold out, right, and hope that, it's kind of almost a Hail Mary, right, that by some chance Trump would be disqualified based upon convictions and things like that. But based upon what we've seen tonight, just in terms of the exit polling, who's voting for whom, what they're saying, she kind of would have the inverse problem that Trump is going to be facing towards November, where you would have 2/3 of the electorate that didn't want you. So now you have to convince 2/3 of them to vote for you when she has shown unfavorability ratings across those voters. 2/3 have voted against her. So it becomes almost an uphill battle, right? It's to be the last woman standing there, but then to pivot into a general election race, that becomes a very hard climb.
And I know that we've mostly been talking about, the election for president. Tonight, there were also elections taking place across the country for, county school boards, and North Carolina governor is a big one in certain roles there. Is there anything, on the local side that you've been taking a look at in terms of, North Carolina?
Yeah, so if we kind of think about, this is the first election cycle where we're really seeing the new maps take place, right? So in North Carolina, Texas, and to some extent Alabama, right, redistricting created some new districts which are more favorable to Democrats, right? So it's going to set up some really interesting matchups in November. Again, it's all going back to the Democrats, right? They want to flip the House. We saw today Christian Sinema said she's not going to be running for Senate in Arizona. So that takes, some, if we think about them holding this, Democrats holding the Senate, right? That takes a little bit of pressure off them because you potentially had an independent in Sinema and then maybe a Democrat and then they would split the vote and then a Republican might pick up. Well, now it's just basically going to be a Democrat versus a Republican, most likely Carrie Lake at that point. In terms of, kind of key races, like I said, the Democrats, they need 4 seats to flip the House. And we've got all these new maps across the country post-redistricting, so it makes, in many cases, a lot of these districts more favorable to Democrats, some states more favorable to Republicans, so it's going to be how that shakes out. And then the other thing that I think is just really interesting to look at is the Senate race in California, right, for the late Feinstein. You have 3 Democrats going head-to-head, and you have 1 Republican there. And the way that the balloting works in California is you have essentially a blanket primary with top 2. So all of the candidates, be it Republican, Democrat, you name it, will be on 1 ballot. And the top 2 vote getters out of the election tonight will move on to November. So you could end up with a scenario where 2 Democrats move on to November. You could end up with a scenario where, because you have 3 Democrats splitting the vote, and with the turnout we potentially will see in California tonight for Trump, does that Republican slip in there? And now you have a head-to-head between a Republican and a Democrat in November as well, too.
Wow, that's really going to change up what we're going to see, depending on how people, and that is an example of where people do actually need to turn out for the primary.
Right. And but you look at some of the candidates, at least on the Democratic side in California, and they're saying, hey, look, if the Republican kind of slips in here and we go to November, we would love to face off against the Republican as opposed to, 2 Democrats facing off. So it very much is going back to civic duty is important. Go out, go vote, even if you don't think that your vote matters. Especially in some of these down-ballot races, your vote is really going to matter here.
And we're just about at 9. I just wanted to ask, is there anything else about this election in particular that, you've been taking a look at or you sort of want to highlight as the night goes on?
And I think it's what I've been watching, and I think what the exit polling is showing us is tonight is not so much about who turned out to vote, it's who didn't turn out to vote. And that's where the parties from tonight, eyes are going to be shifting, looking to November and saying, all right, who do we have to motivate? What do they need to hear? How do we get that vote out in November?
That's going to be interesting, and I guess we'll see, and hopefully you'll see too, at school with your students who are in that age group, we'll see how motivated they are. Ben, thank you so much. Just before we head out here, I just wanted to turn everyone's attention to WAVY.com, where results are coming in, as we speak for different, the elections and counties that have been going on. So here you can see that the lieutenant governor race is on here. That's still not been called yet. Attorney General. So you still need to go to WAVY.com, take a look at the results and see, what else is coming in by the end of the night. Obviously, we already know the GOP primary candidate that is projected to win, but in terms of sort of what it'll look like locally, we just don't have enough information yet. But Ben, thank you so much again for, being with us tonight and giving us all these insights. It's a lot to think about. This conversation seems that it will continue as we see what happens going toward the general election with the legal battles, with where Nikki Haley stands and more. So thank you so much. And I'm sure you'll be back again soon.
My pleasure, as always.